So hi, everybody. I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany, and I welcome you all to our regular gathering on Clubhouse. Each week, we check in with Berlin-based journalists to talk about the emerging stories that are front and center in Germany. And today, we're actually taking our experiment a little bit further by simultaneously hosting our weekly Kaffeepause, What's a Buzz in Berlin, on both Clubhouse and on Zoom. So I hope all of you have a cup of coffee at the ready and that you are prepared for today's conversation with Bloomberg opinion columnist Andreas Kluth, who was previously editor-in-chief of Handelsblatt Global and a writer for The Economist. Hello, Andreas. It's great to see you.
Hi, Steve. Great to see you again.
So, Andreas, in Clubhouse style, before we dive in, can you briefly introduce yourself to everybody?
Yeah, as you said, I've been a journalist for over 20 years. For actually exactly 20 years, I was at The Economist, but one of these Economist careers started in London, went to Asia, went to California for 9 years, then came here to Berlin in 2012. My parents are German. I'm a dual citizen, US and German. It was a complete coincidence that I'm here. It wasn't because of that background. So I kind of reconnected with the country of my parents, and that was fascinating. And then I left to lead the English language publication of a German business weekly called Handelsblatt. And that was great fun and a journalistic success, but there was no business model. That's a common problem nowadays. So that folded, and now I'm very happy to be at Bloomberg Opinion, where, in a sense, when I was at The Economist, that's kind of opinionated journalism anyway. Now I pine for a living. I just hopefully in a very analytical, nutritious way.
And as you said before we started, you've been having a lot of fun since you joined Bloomberg Opinion, and you've really had a lot of sort of freedom to write about the things that interest you. You and I have emailed back and forth in English and German and tried to figure out which language we should communicate in because of your background in history. But because of your background, I also was interested in your piece recently about the change to summertime and daylight savings time, and that you felt at least an hour closer to your homeland of the United States during the last 2 weeks.
We had that 2 weeks where the U.S., or except for Arizona and one other state, what was it? Spring forward. Yeah, sprang forward. Right. And here we didn't yet. So now we, as of today or as of yesterday, we are 6 hours apart again, you and me. But it's just intellectually the most stimulating, and it's just a cornucopia. Wherever I feel like a heat-seeking missile. Wherever there's an interesting subject, I just write about it. And I've never had quite that freedom before in my career. I mean, from mRNA vaccines to social revolutions, it's not just Germany, it's not just the EU, that also, but from social science, what makes a good conversation, a bad conversation, introverts, extroverts, all of that I've covered, and that's just fun because it just keeps it exciting. But of course, in Germany now, to get to our topic, I mean, as we go towards September, it'll be more and more frequent that I'll have to write about Germany.
Well, Andreas, I was going to say that there's no shortage of interesting topics to write about and to talk about, and so I'm really happy to have this opportunity to speak with you today, and thought that we could start our conversation by talking about the latest round of discussions and debates over the measures to slow a third spike in COVID cases in Germany, and specifically begin with last night, because last night, Chancellor Angela Merkel appeared on the weekly television show with Anna Will, and she seemed unhappy, concerned. She is obviously under attack about her authority and management of the pandemic, but she seemed to come across pretty strongly when she said that if the states do not take greater action in trying to slow the wave of the pandemic, then maybe the federal government has to take on a more active role. Can you talk a little bit about what the chancellor actually said last night and
Yes.
what that might look like?
Yeah, she was being typical Merkel. Whenever there's a big crisis, she goes on the show with Anne Will. So she did twice during the migrant refugee crisis, 2015, 16. And I'm pretty sure she did it after Fukushima or one other thing. And they just have a woman-to-woman chat. And she, as you probably know in your viewers, she is not someone to sort of have big sound bites. She likes to get into nuance. She likes to analyze. She's quite detailed. So this is a good forum for her. She didn't say anything remarkably clear about that. And yet I do find it just as interesting as you, and therefore am making it the subject of my upcoming column, which is this topic of federalism. She cannot, it's in the Constitution, change federalism, but viewers in the US will understand the US, Switzerland, Belgium, Austria, many countries are federal, Australia, Canada, and many countries are not. And it's usually seen as a strength. But what she was strongly not suggesting, saying is that here in Germany, she thinks at the moment it seems to have become a problem. That is, they have the 16 governors, premiers, whatever you call them, of the 16 states meet with Merkel and her people regularly, usually into the wee hours, which is also the sort of staging, the theatricality of it is another thing. But to agree to because the legal remit for lockdowns for most of these measures lies with the states, as in the US. However, they want to avoid what they call a patchwork quilt. The German word is Flickenteppich, to confuse people. Of course, we're all confused, but they say they want to avoid that. And so they have these long meetings to get on the same page. And yet after the next morning, they still end up doing and saying different things and end up confusing us. So just specifically, I mean, I'm in Berlin. Berlin seems to be trying to relax regulations a little bit. The state that is trying hardest or is making preparations to relax is a small state called Saarland. I'm not sure if there's an English cognate to that, but it's on the French border. And they have a comparatively moderate caseload. And so that the governor there is also a Christian Democrat, a conservative. So that it's not like a left-right thing. It's just, he says, no, we want to keep, we see no reason to tighten. Whereas Merkel and the others say, well, look, there's mutations, there's variants going around, they're very dangerous, and our caseload has been going up. It is going up. The R number, is about 1.17 as of when I checked this morning. So 100 people infect 117. That would be pointing toward exponential growth. The caseload is 130 plus new infections per 100,000 per week. That's way above the 50 that this group of the 16 plus Merkel had once agreed as the threshold where tightening would kick in. And yet, so you have some states loosening, others, including the Bavarians, governor who's interesting, and we'll talk about him, saying, yeah, no, Merkel's right. If everyone keeps doing their own thing, we have to change something. And just to sort of even throw that in there, that the German federalism in this consensual culture is part of a problem, I find very interesting. And it does suggest to me that, I mean, God, and also you have to talk about something. And I think they're all struggling. They don't know. I genuinely think we're all at a loss on what to do. We were all trying to open right about now.
Right.
And 2 of my 3 kids are sometimes in school, not others so, that it was supposed to go that way. And suddenly it seems like because of the mutations, we have to go another way, and we're not on the same page. And she was there. She hinted that she's very unhappy about that. That was her word. And that they might have to tweak the infectious diseases law to maybe give the federal government more powers in this respect. And I think that would be a very interesting debate.
Well, but Andreas, I think you've just touched on a really important point. This is not something that the chancellor can do on his or her own, right? I mean, this is something where, and you just talked about the infectious disease law, there would have to be a vote in the Bundestag. Whatever the new policies are would still have to be carried out at the state level, because that's where the ability is to carry out the measures in the law. And so you've still got that stress between the federal level and the state level of
And in fact,
government.
the law would have to also go through the Bundesrat, which is composed of the 16 states. So they'd have to essentially agree to. And as you know, they sit there in many color combinations of different party coalitions. So as essentially, all parties and most states would have to agree to give the feds more powers in that way. Yeah.
Well, and that's actually where I was going, because both in the Bundestag and in the Bundesrat, there are Christian Democrats. And given everything that's been going on within the CDU and some of the criticism that Merkel also expressed at Armin Laschet, the minister president of North Rhine-Westphalia, and the party leader, what's the likelihood that the Christian Democrats would go along with this kind of a change in the law and a more active role of the federal level?
It'll be interesting to see how this plays out, but maybe now is not too early to introduce two of the characters there, because that gets caught up in the other decision. Because we mentioned several governors already, but we mentioned Markus Söder of Bavaria, who's a conservative, not a Christian Democrat, but the sister party. And he already on TV last night, almost immediately after she spoke, said, yep, she's right. I mean, this is all silly. We need to give the... So he already came out, and he's known for being on the side, on the hawkish side of this in terms of the lockdowns, but also now giving the feds more powers. And the guy who hasn't spoken yet is the Christian Democratic leader, who's also the governor of North Rhine-Westphalia, who's wanting to loosen. And throughout the past years, it's always been like that. He rhetorically wants to loosen, and Bavaria and Söder and Bavaria. And those two guys, of course, I'm sure everyone in the Clubhouse chat knows, are the two who have to decide between themselves. And they said they'd do it just after Easter. One of them will be the candidate for this conservative camp, and therefore running to succeed Merkel. So these two debates will become one debate, essentially. I have a hunch on who's got the stronger hand right now, but that means it's unpredictable.
Mm-hmm.
If I had to guess right now, I would think that it'll be Söder, and it will be, yes, they will get more federal powers to manage the infectious diseases.
So what I had read this morning and heard on Deutschlandradio was that Armin Laschet had sort of defended the measures that had been introduced in North Rhine-Westphalia and sort of wanted to make at least appearances that his leadership and his response had been adequate in his state. But he also said that the next Ministerpräsidentenkonferenz, the next MPK, or meeting of the minister presidents, really needs to be in person and needs to be prepared for better than last week's minister president conference, to try to get a little bit more clarity about the next steps.
Yeah, I think he's panicking for Laschet for a number of reasons. And that's exactly the sort of, try to parse that for me, what that means. They want more clarity. They've been saying that, or turn it around. Is anyone against clarity? No. So that's always safe to call for more clarity. He's conveniently neglecting that he's one of the people who's made it unclear. That's, and not just now, but throughout. We're allowed to be opinionated in this chat. He's a very unimpressive speaker, motivator, thinker. He is a typical Merkelian, slicing and dicing at him, tries to go all ways, tries to be centrist, tries to make everyone happy. And as a result, drifts. Söder has a much sharper edge. He's just a centrist. But so, for instance, exactly, I didn't read this particular piece, but the one you just told me about, that sounds like him. I'm not sure what that means. They've had a lot of meetings, and they're often clear in the meetings. They're just not clear the day later. And it's because of him. So what is he going to do? I mean, he is, the other thing about him, he's panicking. He really wants to be the candidate, but he sees the polls. And we have to talk at some point about the polls a bit, because there's been more movement in the past few weeks than in the last 3 years. And it's all bad news for him, Laschet. And it's bad news for the conservatives. But it's not, I think, bad news for Söder. And that's what's changed. And Söder knows it, Merkel knows it, and Laschet knows it.
So before we get to the polls, one more question about this current situation and how Merkel is sort of playing it out. As everybody knows, Merkel is not running again. I think that there were some views of her as possibly being a lame duck during the last few months of her chancellorship. Is what's going on right now her showing the German people that she's not a lame duck and that she is still in a position to make decisions and to act for the country? Or is there something else going on?
I think Anne Will asked her that directly in a different way last night. And of course, what is she going to say? As soon as you say I'm phasing myself out, then you're a lame duck. I mean, she's a lame duck in the sense that we know she'll be a caretaker come October and then out come November or December or January at the latest, and wants to have a smooth handover. But until that time, we have a crisis. It'd be like, Churchill at the end of World War II and then getting voted out while he's at the Potsdam conference. You're in until someone else is in, and we have a pandemic. And there'll be many thousands, I don't know, of German dead because of COVID until she hands over to someone else. So she of course has to stay in charge. There's the tension that she's always been more aware of than most people, between the leadership of her party, which is now Laschet's officially, and the leadership of the government, which is hers. And that split in these situations is not a healthy one usually. They just have to navigate it. But because I see Laschet as being so weak, I would say that for the next few months, there is still one German leader, and that's Merkel.
So, Andreas, you mentioned that there's been some volatility in the polls, some movement in the opinion polls in recent weeks. And I wanted to ask you what the mood in Germany is like at the moment. But perhaps one way to get at that is by looking at some of those polls. Can you share with us the recent polls?
Well, if you start at the last election, federal election 2017, it's interesting. I'll just, CDU had about 1.33. I mean, the conservative camp, SPD about 20. The Greens were still quite small, about 9. The Liberals had 11. The left 9, and the AfD was at almost 13. But then things changed, and for about 3 years, there was very little movement, really. Okay, and there was really one big trend and a couple of smaller ones. The big trend was, I think, something in the zeitgeist changed, and the Greens became much more popular. People started seeing them as having an answer for the future that the others didn't have, and the Greens kept going up and up. Briefly had more support than the Christian Democrats even, but they're still very strong, and they're now at about 23%. So remember, last election 9, now 23. That's the main trend. Another interesting thing is the AfD, the far-right party, that's the populist party. There was a lot of hand-wringing about the far-right and Nazis and stuff in Germany, and where is this going? And I think everything looks like they peaked, because they stagnated since the election. and have been becoming irrelevant. Because, of course, no one of their protest voters would associate the adjective responsible with them, and now we're in a pandemic. Yet then the pandemic started, and the Christian Democrats got a lot of recognition because they were governing, they're in power, and they're keeping us safe. Hopefully, Germany was having a pretty good pandemic for most of last year, and they were so strong. That while their coalition partners, the Social Democrats, were not, they're just not given that kind of credit, that what you had until a couple of weeks ago was the following situation. And so therefore I thought it was a done deal what would happen. And very briefly, no one will do a coalition with the AfD. So you take them out. What does that leave? Of the 6 parties, you take that one out, that leaves 5 in the federal, and you need 50% or more of seats. And there was no way to get there without the CDU, CSU, without the conservatives. And that was the reality. So therefore, it was pretty much, I think, assumed by people like me that whoever would become the candidate of the conservatives will be the next chancellor. And almost certainly with the next strongest party, which is the Greens. What's been happening in recent weeks is that very stable situation in the polls has been totally shaken up. People, because of the third wave, have lost confidence, maybe just temporarily, but in the conservatives, so they've given some of their gains back. The Greens have not. They're still strong. And the movements in the other parties cancel out. So what's the new situation you have? It means that the election in September is suddenly genuinely up for grabs, not just the coalition, but the question of who is chancellor. And Söder makes that explicit. It's in his interest to make people nervous in that way. It could be because for the first time, so in the last 3 years, it was not, that was my point earlier, it was not mathematically possible to have a coalition without the CDU. Now it is become mathematically possible for a coalition of the Greens, the Social Democrats, and the Liberal Free Democrats. That's called the traffic lights because their colors are red, green, and yellow. Or in the latest poll that I'm looking at just now, but this is the first one, it's even possible to have an all-left coalition of the Social Democrats, the Greens, and the far left party called the Left. And that would be a radical turn for Germany. And Söder and people like that will use that specter to campaign. It may be just a blip, but that genuinely shakes it up because it means basically there could be a Green chancellor in September. And of course, that would be historic. It would be a first, but it also means which of the 2 candidates on the Green side is going to do it,
So I definitely want to drill down into some of the sort of party landscape and what's going on. But before doing that, we have a viewer question from Martin, and I'd like to allow Martin to ask his question himself. Go ahead.
All right, can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
All right, good morning, good afternoon, Andreas. Martin Schultz here. Had a real quick question about Söder.
I have to say, when I saw your name come up, I did a double take. Yeah, I thought, are you the previous Social Democratic candidate? But you're clearly not.
Yeah, I'm a little taller, have a little more hair, and I'm a little more to the right. But anyway, the question I have about Söder is you mentioned that he's got a what apparently is more of a status view in this current pandemic situation in terms of wanting to become more of a federal-oriented, I guess, response, or I guess a status response. That's somewhat surprising, I would think, since historically the CSU and Bavaria have always pushed the federalist buttons. Is that just for his kind of personal way of taking the chancellorship or running, or is that something more different?
I've watched Söder over the years, and you have to get used to this. Söder can go any way he wants, and he's notoriously flexible. He has shown before he became leader of the Bavarian Party and of the Bavarian state, he tried out several personas, including a very populist one, like a soft AfD one during the refugee crisis. Then he realized that wasn't working, and he dropped that, and he's taken on a very different tone, very fluidly. And it's amazing. Voters help him out because he's good-natured. He has a sense of humor. You want to give him the benefit of the doubt. I've seen him do the same thing because of what we said earlier, is because he realizes he might have to do a coalition with the Greens. He hammers them in rhetorically, but he's quietly been adopting lots of very environmentally policies that he used to be against in recent years. Bavaria recently came to our attention for having some sort of voter initiative referendum on bees and basically good things for bees. And I'm all for bees, but the surprising thing was the enthusiasm that Söder brought to that topic, for which he wasn't previously known. So he does this all the time. Now, as you said, Bavaria is actually the state in German history, post-war history, certainly, that's been most federalist in other words, most for states' rights. I don't know, we shouldn't use that word, I guess, with American context. But I don't know if you knew this, but Bavaria never ratified the German federal constitution. It observes it, but it didn't ratify it as a gesture. It is also the only state that is largely in its historic borders of when it was last a kingdom. The others are largely creations of the Allies, like North Rhine-Westphalia, So you're absolutely right. Bavaria usually makes the biggest fuss about not giving powers to Berlin, but Söder has been trying for the whole year and is trying now to not let this bad pandemic situation stick to him. I think he wants to be the candidate and wants to become chancellor, and I think he can be. And he realizes he has to just apply different rules, talk a different tone. I probably agree with him. And I think opportunistically, the way he is, says, yeah, it's practical. It helps him. It makes him sound tough. That's the kind of turn. So you're very observant in pointing that out. But that's how I see it. I think he's not one to struggle with the contradiction intellectually or anything like that. He's a happy warrior in that sense.
All right, thank you.
So, Andreas, I'd like to come back to your analysis of sort of the party landscape and what might happen. Obviously, it's an eternity between now and September, and a lot of things can happen. But it was interesting after the elections in Baden-Württemberg and Rheinland-Pfalz. I think Laschet even said that it's possible to imagine a government without the CDU, which I think many people interpreted as a call to action, because there could be a red-red-green or green-red-red or a traffic light coalition. But in those scenarios, the SPD would have to be a little bit stronger than it is right now. What is going on with the SPD? Because in my view, they seem to be conspicuous through their absence at the moment. One doesn't really see very much of them.
The SPD would not necessarily have to get much stronger as long as the Greens are very strong and the left doesn't get too weak, or the FDP doesn't get too weak to have alternative combinations. The SPD hasn't accepted, and their candidate, Olaf Scholz, who's now finance minister, who's also, by the way, an unbelievable, he has zero, from my point of view, sorry if you happen to like him, but has zero charisma, is very unimpressive in lots of ways, a very typical German sort of gray mouse politician, and I think would be a bad chancellor. And people don't seem to like him. We can go into some of the personal poll numbers in a moment, but what they've not accepted yet is the new reality. Is, they used to, America has presidential debates, and in the German parliamentary system that doesn't work. But at some point they started taking the debate format from America, and it really doesn't work in Germany, and having the Christian Democrat and the Social Democrat candidates debate each other. And that's just part of it was always assumed that a chancellor would be either a Christian Democrat or a Social Democrat. The polls since the last elections have said no. It's the alternative is a Christian Democrat, if it's center right, or on the center left, a Green. No one said that, but so the Social Democrat, it wouldn't be Scholz. It would be either Robert Habeck or Annalena Baerbock of the Greens. Yeah. So and he will do anything but admit that, because I think as soon as you admit it, everyone realizes, oh, that's the new normal, and then it becomes real. That was interesting. Both Laschet and Söder said that it's imaginable that a chancellor that's not a Christian, not a conservative, could be it. And I also wondered, why did you say it? And I do think they want to stir people up and cause that fear of many Germans of red, red, green, and hope that mobilizes them and reminds them of what's at stake, and overrides the frustration many Germans have in the general management of the pandemic, which is not all the German government's fault. It's a pandemic, it's everywhere, but it is very difficult, and it's probably going to get more frustrating. So it's interesting that so early they said that. They could have said, hey, this is just a blip, we got it, I have no sense on whether it's a blip. By the summer, I think a lot of it depends on the virus, which is very bad for political analysis, because you don't know what it's going to do, mutations and stuff. But so just to make that clear, it wouldn't be a Social Democrat chancellor, it'd be a Green chancellor. And the Social Democrat would be, if they're lucky, the finance minister or something like that.
Which would be okay for Scholz, right? I mean, he'd stay on in his role as vice chancellor, presumably, but still, it's not the direction that he would have expected. Yeah. I guess one question. I mean, you were talking a little bit just now about the management of the pandemic really being the reason for supporting or not supporting certain parties and certain personalities and actors. But I don't think we've talked at all in our conversation about some of the scandals, corruption scandals within the CDU. And I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you what sort of an impact you think those might be having on the popularity of the party as well.
They certainly didn't help and hurt, but I don't think they hurt that much. I mean, that's what I heard from Manfred Güllner, for instance, pollsters, is so several in the conservative camp in both the Bavarian and the National Party got commissions from brokering deals with mask manufacturers last year, that at a time when they were scarce. That's just awful. But of course, this is exactly the sort of thing that all three, Merkel, Laschet, Söder, are good at. They crack down, they look tough. I think it's the sort of thing that ticked everyone off this month. By the summer, no one will bring that up, because they're going to really clean up on that stuff now, unless more stuff comes out, which is possible. But it's also possible, by the way, that on the Social Democrats, these kinds of scandals often cut both ways, and therefore are hard to make hay out of for the opposition. If one, a Social Democrat, they're also in government. So I think that'll probably not be the main factor. The others are pretty big enough. There's a lot of other reasons to be angry.
So before we widen the aperture a little bit and bring in another viewer question, I'd like to ask you a little bit about what's going on within the AfD, the Alternative für Deutschland. You had mentioned them a little bit earlier. None of the other parties will join a coalition with the AfD. Of course, everybody's watching the AfD closely. They lost traction in the state elections earlier this month. I guess the next state elections will be in Sachsen-Anhalt, and they might do a little bit better there. They've lost some of the support because they've not been able to respond to the pandemic in sort of a leadership manner. Can you tell us a little bit about what's going on within the AFD, the jockeying for leadership, the party platform that they're expected to announce soon, and what you think their role might be moving forward?
The AFD, the FDP, and the left are the three smaller parties that are roughly the same, and they're all equally worth watching because of the role that they play in the mathematics. And the FDP is the one that's changing now. On the AFD side, they've had, and this, I'm not sure this is a Europe-wide trend, but for about a year, I've been wondering about, is the pandemic good for populists or bad for populists in general? Because on one hand, you do get QAnon and conspiracy theories and extreme frustration and anger, which would generally help populists, and not just in Germany, but everywhere. QAnon, by the way, is the outside of America. Germany is the country with the largest following of QAnon. I mean, I thought that was interesting. On the other side, populists being populists, so you notice that Italy has gone back to a technocrat government tolerated by the populists. The populists basically are shutting up because they realize people are worried about dying and getting sick, and the populists have no answer. I mean, populism is you try to appeal to people's resentments, and the AFD here in Germany has been singularly unhelpful and irresponsible, and even people who might have liked them once for other reasons, because they're East Germans and they're upset about how reunification went for them, or about foreigners and refugees, wait a second, they have nothing to say about this. On top of that, the AFD has, and they've done this in several rounds since they were founded in 2013, I think. They always have this tension internally between between the moderates by their standards and the extreme far right, which borders neo-Nazism. And they always realize, I think it's often that one generation of leaders realize, as soon as we drift off on the right edge, we're gone. So keep it real, okay? And then there's people who genuinely loathe that. And so for instance, when the refugee crisis broke out in 2015, that summer, the AFD almost broke apart completely and was at about 5%, which is the threshold to get into parliament. So they might have disappeared, as all previous far-right parties at the federal level had disappeared in West German history. And then the refugee crisis happened, and suddenly they got this bounce from that. And so now they have this internal struggle again, and it's making a lot of people nervous. And on top of that, an interesting decision by the domestic spying service of Germany, which the US doesn't have something like that. But after World War II, after the Nazis, they said, look, we're going to have, on top of the external spying service, we're going to have one that investigates and observes, so that anybody who might, as in Weimar, try to overthrow the constitution. And they decided they were watching basically neo-Nazi, I'll say, a far-right wing of the AFD. And then recently they said, actually, we're watching the whole party. Doesn't mean much, to be honest, watching them, and just, but in terms of a lot of people who, I think it's happening that they are at risk of, tipping over the edge on the far right. None of that has helped them, and certainly, but I think I still think in the undertow is the pandemic. I don't think even I've talked to supporters of them. I don't think there's anyone who seriously thinks that they have answers to the pandemic, that giving a vote to the FD would make that better. So as long as you think that's a big topic, they're not going to benefit from that,
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. I think that's all worth keeping in mind as we look to the state elections that are still yet to come, but also, of course, the federal elections.
And of course, as you said, by the way, the state election in East Germany, all the East German states, Saxony-Anhalt, they will seem to do very well.
Yes.
In general, they're in the polls. They're about double in the East what they are in the West. But I think that is atypical. I mean, if you watch this stuff over time, you don't freak out about that. That's just almost a given.
So I'd now like to bring board member Dale Ponikvar into the conversation to ask what might end up being a closing question, but certainly will sort of widen the aperture of our conversation today. Dale, go ahead.
Thank you, Steve. And hello, Andreas. I've been a fan of yours and glad to see you reappear. I enjoyed the Handelsblatt.
Oh, thank you, Dale.
Question about the United States. I was surprised in reading through Spiegel this past week or so that Anthony Blinken's appearances were not received well by Spiegel. And I wanted to ask you just a kind of compound question. What is the general public reaction, if there is such a thing, apart from the reaction of the different political parties to the, quote, new and improved or old and revised U.S. foreign policy?
The public reaction is very German and predictable and depressing, which is barely note. The German public is not just navel gazing, but foreign policy is never a big issue in election campaigns, and in polls, the German population predictably gives banal and naive views on things like how much to spend on the military in the context of the 2% goal as 2% of GDP that was agreed by NATO. That's one of the things you referred to, and other issues like Nord Stream 2, the gas pipeline. So in the public debate, no normal person was aware that Blinken spoke to NATO allies this past week at all. But I think Germany is not unique in that respect. I mean, if you ask sort of Danes or even Americans, Canadians, what do they think about Heiko Maas? They wouldn't have. But the sort of smaller group of people like Steve and you and me and the usual suspects in the think tanks here, I think there's a surprise and concern because when Biden was president-elect, there was an interesting debate that I covered in several columns. On one hand, everyone realized that America and Europe will keep drifting apart, like the Atlantic Ocean geologically, because America, since that pivot to Asia under Obama, Biden, has its priorities somewhere else, mainly on China, and that the old problems between Germany and the US won't go away, especially the pipeline. But that we're going to try to find new answers in a new tone now that Trump is out and Biden's in. And in particular, the German defense minister, Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, made an interesting offer and basically said, yeah, let's just say it as it is. We can't defend ourselves without the US, so let's be good allies. Let's have a division of labor. You need to have your hands free in Asia and the rest of the world, and you need good allies. We'll take care of the Mediterranean and maybe the Baltic and stuff, but you still help us, And so she's, I think, the most Atlanticist in that cabinet, and Merkel keeps herself covered. And I was hoping, well, why not make a grand gesture? I feel that Merkel snubbed Biden twice in a row, and that's what surprises and depresses me. And I think that's what Blinken, I read some comments by him that says, yeah, okay, he's trying to be diplomatic, but I think they're pretty ticked off, and they have reason to be. Snub number one is on Merkel's initiative because in December, because Germany held the rotating presidency in the Council of the European Union in Brussels, and Germany had that until December 31st. She pushed through with Xi Jinping of China an investment deal they'd been working on for 7 years, where it was going nowhere. And suddenly they struck the deal, and it still has to be ratified. And of course, that was just before Biden came in and wanted to talk about a joint stance vis-a-vis China. I won't even say against China, but just to coordinate. Why was that necessary? So that was a terrible signal, and I told him that, and her advisor, Alexandre Kroller. And the second thing is this cursed, stupid pipeline, which everyone's against. So from Germany to Russia, Ukraine, of course, is against, Poland, Latvia, everyone's against it. France is against it. The European Parliament is against it. And of course, the US is against it. I'm pretty sure Canada, I didn't even check. Everyone's accepted it against, except Germany, maybe Austria. And this goes into, and they're holding on to that. And it's almost 96% finished. But it'd be very easy to freeze that, to do something. And I think maybe that's what she's doing without saying so. But the official German position is we want to finish it and pipe gas through it from Russia to Germany. And it goes to that old German, intra-German split between people romanticizing Russia, mainly on the Social Democrat and the left side, but also the AfD, and people wanting to be Atlanticist and thinking strategically versus, well, in this case, egotistically. So I think we've all been surprised that there's been, I really thought there'd be shuttle diplomacy, nice calls, much more sort of hand-holding smiles between Blinken and Maas and everyone, as everyone tries to signal to the world, look, it's going to get better, even if there's nothing substantive. And in fact, there's been nothing, in fact, instead of what I would characterize as two snubs, just snubs, not more than that. But so I'm disappointed by that. Don't know if that got to your heart of your question.
Well, Andreas, I think there's a lot more to talk about when it comes to the transatlantic relationship, and perhaps we could do that another day. I think Biden and his administration have been clear that America is back and that America wants to re-engage with its allies, but that doesn't mean that the sticking points disappear. And certainly with Nord Stream 2 and also with policy vis-a-vis China, there are sticking points, but at least there's a change in tone and perhaps a better opportunity for engagement and for dialogue. I want to push you on just one thing before we wrap up, though, and that is with regard to the EU-China investment agreement that was reached in December. Yes, you're absolutely right. That was just before Biden came into office in January, and there was some consternation in the US as to why Europe would move forward with that before Biden was in office, and basically removing the ability for Europe and the US to work together on that level. But one also has to keep in mind that at the end of December, Germany's presidency of the European Council came to an end. And I wonder to what degree having this as a win for Germany, for Merkel, at the end of the presidency of the European Council was a factor in trying to push that investment agreement through.
Well, I mean, this is, it's possible. I mean, because, Merkel in that sense was trying hard to get two wins, and as a result does what she does, which is make compromises that arguably go too far. The other one was to get the recovery fund for Europe in an interesting ideological about turn. We don't want to open another topic at this point in the call, and she wanted to get those things through the German presidency, also as part of her legacy, arguably. But I think she genuinely views the matter differently also than Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer. So I genuinely think that she was so spooked by Trump, but even earlier, she genuinely thinks that Europe and Germany should not be blackmailable by anyone, even the US and a future president, and that should not equidistant, but should keep its options open. So that's a kind way of putting it. And I think she generally wants to not become the US's pawn in the games either against China or Russia. But I just happen to think that that's the wrong way to go, and that Germany was always fared better as part of Westbindung, that tradition, when it made clear that it was part of the West, and it wasn't ambiguous about it in that way, you know. But you're right. I mean, she's an intelligent woman. There's a lot of calculations at the same time going on in that head.
Undoubtedly, undoubtedly. Well, Andreas, I want to thank you for taking the time to talk with us today. This has been, I think, a fantastic and obviously wide-ranging discussion. Lots more to talk about, and I look forward to talking with you in the weeks ahead about some of the issues that we've touched on today, but also other breaking stories as they emerge. So great to see you, at least virtually. Thank you for being with us. And
Thank
to our
you.
viewers on Zoom and to our listeners on Clubhouse, we will be having our Kaffeepause each week. So feel free to spread the word. And if you have any comments or feedback, please let us know. But Andreas, thanks to you in Berlin.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you all.